RoboCop is kind of a strange series of films consisting of an original trilogy and a remake, and a bunch of other shit I'll talk about later. The character is mentioned in the same breath as other action series from the time, with Paul Verhoeven's clear satirical look at 80s America often glossed over, and the franchise clearly having a bit of an identity crisis in the wake of its first entry. I've only ever seen this first film and the remake in their entirety though. At some point I saw some bits and pieces of RoboCop 2 as well. I guess we'll talk about the other films in the trilogy later, probably, but for now let's focus on the original, which is one of my favorite films of the era.
Pakistan is threatening my border!
That's it, Buster. No more military aid.
The story of RoboCop was conceived by Edward Neimer, who came up with the idea when working on the Warner Brothers backlot where Blade Runner was also being made, envisioning the concept of a possible future, a la Blade Runner, but with a different swing on the Blade Runner dystopia, and Neimer, who also was a fan of action movies, figured why not make a cop protagonist. In the 1980s and 90s, filmmakers loved making cop movies: Hollywood Cop, Samurai Cop, Beverly Hills Cop, Cop, Maniac Cop, Psycho Cop, Kindergarten Cop, Demon Cop, Vampire Cop, Karate Cop, Cyborg Cop, Time Cop, Gladiator Cop, it goes on and on. Okay, to be fair, there were only a handful of odd cop movies before the 80s and 90s, but after RoboCop, people realized cops sell. Beverly Hills Cop came out before RoboCop, but I think the double whammy of RoboCop and Beverly Hills Cop created the perfect environment for such a trend to pop up. Neimer met with another aspiring filmmaker, Michael Miner, and the pair worked together to develop the script of RoboCop, with the idea to kill Alex Murphy after following him for a bit, inspired by Psycho. Then, when Murphy's revived as RoboCop, they wanted to kind of ponder how big business would handle such a scenario. With Murphy no longer having his memories and his new robotic body, developed by the company, they wanted to grapple the question of autonomy versus IP, and ask the question if RoboCop was truly human, while proposing how crazy and dystopian such a question even was.
You have to think about the potential risks as we go down this road.
Absolutely.
They also wrote the news sections and advertisements into the film for multiple purposes. 1, to deliver subtle exposition, and 2, to establish how casually dystopian old Detroit has become. The script began making it around the industry until it was sold to Orion Pictures, with director Jonathan Kaplan and producer John Davison starting to make the script an actual film. Davison would have the pair rework their script slightly, praising the satire but screening films like The Road Warrior for them, and explaining that he thought it'd be a good look and feel for the satirical film over something more neon like Blade Runner, which shows pretty well in a lot of ways. RoboCop's Detroit feels a lot like the post-apocalyptic deserts we see in George Miller's Mad Max series. Jonathan Kaplan ended up leaving the project he helped court to Orion as an opportunity came up to direct Project X, a film starring Matthew Broderick in the wake of Ferris Bueller. That film would go on to basically make no waves. It didn't lose a lot of money and it didn't get terrible scores, but it didn't make much of an impact, and no one remembers Project X today. The film was offered to several other filmmakers: David Cronenberg of The Fly, Alex Cox of Repo Man, and Monty Hellman of Two Lane Blacktop, all of whom would have made a pretty interesting take on RoboCop, but all declined the offers for one reason or another. Instead, Orion ended up picking up Paul Verhoeven, who was pretty well only known for his Dutch film work up to this point. The then unknown in the West filmmaker pretty much just trashed the script upon a glance, but after being prodded into considering the film's deeper themes and subtexts, Verhoeven took another look, and still didn't get it. But his wife was like, "Hey man, this shit is good, you should do it." And upon reflection, Verhoeven realized he was drawn to the sequence when RoboCop went back to his former house he owned as Murphy, and thought there may be some meat on the bone to chew here, so he finally signed on. The directors and the writers met to finally clean up and create a third draft that fell to both of their likings. Verhoeven wanted the film to be taken very seriously and presented fairly deadpan, which would ultimately likely lead to some subtlety that not every audience member would pick up on, while the duo of writers gave Verhoeven some 2000 AD comics starring Judge Dredd to perhaps further influence the ideas they were looking at for the film. Eventually, Orion forked over $11 million and the team set out to make the film. In terms of casting, they spent a while trying to tie down who would play Alex Murphy in RoboCop. Arnold Schwarzenegger was considered, being that he was a megastar at the time, but may have been too bulky. Michael Ironside, Rutger Hauer, who worked with Verhoeven on his Dutch film Soldier of Orange, Tom Berenger, who's done a million action films, Armand Assante, who's similar to Bergen, has done a lot of stuff, Keith Carradine, another guy who's been in 1,000 things, and James Remar was also considered. Ultimately, they ended up with Peter Weller. Orion wanted Schwarzenegger, but ultimately with his bulk, it made more sense just to do Peter Weller, who was fairly mild-mannered in proportions. Weller was considered for a major role in King Kong Lives, the belated sequel to the 70s reboot of King Kong, but decided RoboCop would be a better fit, especially after meeting with Paul Verhoeven, who by this point was all in on the project, and personally met with Weller to convince him to sign on. With all that set up, most of the major pieces were in play to bring Neumer's original concept to life. The story of RoboCop sees Alex Murphy start a job in Old Detroit, Michigan, which has commissioned the OCP, or Omni Consumer Projects, to set up their advanced police force in order to restore Detroit back to its former glory as the city's been decaying, being overrun with poverty and crime. OCP's plan, however, is to take the city and restructure it into a new settlement known internally as Delta City. The company developed a new robot that is theorized to end crime in Old Detroit, Ed 209, but the robot was a faulty prototype. Leading OCP to have to go back to the drawing board. Meanwhile, Alex Murphy and his partner Ann Lewis pursue a group of thugs to a steel mill. However, Alex is captured and murdered by the crime lord Clarence Boddicker, and pretty brutally at that, with his entire body being destroyed. Clarence had recently been causing a lot of mayhem, killing numerous police officers, and Murphy was the next in a long line. Murphy, however, had his surviving organs transplanted into a new full-body prosthetic, and that prosthetic was named RoboCop.
Huh? Huh? I fucking love that guy!
He has no memories of his past, but maintains some of Alex's mannerisms. The RoboCop project was helmed by Bob Morton, a rival executive of the Ed 209 project lead Dick Jones. RoboCop is sent out for a test and is quickly able to thwart numerous crimes throughout the city, and proves to be more successful than the Ed 209 was. This leads Jones to call in one of his associates to kill Morton. This associate happens to be the man who killed Alex Murphy in the first place, Clarence Boddicker. RoboCop starts piecing together his history and working on the city's rampant crime problem, eventually coming to blows with a henchman complacent with his killing, leading RoboCop to begin hunting down his killer. However, when that confrontation finally happens, he finds Jones with Boddicker, who uses Directive 4 to paralyze RoboCop, and he escapes, sending the Ed 209 and SWAT team in, which critically damage RoboCop. Jones armors up Boddicker and his crew, ordering him to destroy RoboCop in return for a bustling criminal empire as a reward in his new Delta City. RoboCop goes back to hide in the warehouse where he, as Alex Murphy, was killed, with his former partner coming to his aid. Boddicker comes to fight RoboCop, but Lewis and RoboCop manage to defeat Boddicker's gang. Lewis is injured and Boddicker attempts to deal a finishing blow, but RoboCop protects her and kills Boddicker.
Sayonara, RoboCop!
RoboCop, badly damaged, returns to finally deal with Jones, but Jones is protected by Protocol 4. However, the CEO fires Jones, so Protocol 4 no longer protects Jones, allowing RoboCop to shoot him. The CEO comes up to RoboCop and asks what his name is, and RoboCop responds, Murphy, with his memory seemingly restored.
Murphy.
To further break down Alex Murphy and RoboCop's character, I think is a question of autonomy versus IP, as I kind of brought up earlier, and I think it's a poignant message that has become more poignant as time goes on.
Elon Musk, the visionary behind companies like Tesla and SpaceX, has embarked on yet another groundbreaking venture with Neuralink. This brain-computer interface company has been making waves in the tech and medical sectors, and recently, it achieved a significant milestone. Neuralink has been approved by the FDA for its first human clinical trial.
He was harvested without his consent to become RoboCop, and the OCP essentially made him a robot without consent, and he's forced to live by some prime directives, removing his free will altogether, along with the loss of his memory, essentially making him now a product of OCP rather than Alex Murphy, the living human being, until he regained his memory at the end of the film. His prime directives are 1. Serve the public trust, as defined by the law and of course the OCP itself. 2. Protect the innocent, again as defined by the OCP, as it's technically hard to define who and who isn't innocent. 3. To uphold the law, which is defined by the law of the city, which of course the OCP has a big hand in. And his 4th prime directive is to shut down bodily functions if he attempts to apprehend a senior member of the OCP. This of course basically just makes him an agent of the OCP with no autonomy, no memory, and with the OCP using him essentially as a pawn to be able to get enough political power to restructure old Detroit into Delta City. While RoboCop demonstrates that he's highly proficient in protecting the city, he's ultimately a pawn of the OCP's game, no different than something like Ed 209, but having the human element to make him more predictable, in theory. Today, with things like brain chip implants being developed by Neuralink, the satire of RoboCop may not be as much of a satirical view of the future, with humans soon being able to get the option to essentially better connect with our devices through the use of technologies, which would connect us to our devices, which are owned by megacorporations. Neuralink, a company ran by entrepreneur Elon Musk, the owner of companies like Twitter, X, Tesla, SpaceX, and many more ventures, would now literally have a device in your brain if you got Neuralink. While it can be seen as an enhancement and has some potential upsides, it's a little alarming tech companies and moguls are starting to make plays at our physical bodies, and makes me question what the terms of service someone will be required to sign and what you're giving up for such a piece of technology. Regardless of that, it seems in 2024, RoboCop may be less far off than the audience might have thought in 1987 when this movie was released. Alex Murphy's arc is simple, really. When he is killed, he loses his autonomy and started to become a mindless robot living by a set of rules set up by the OCP. Eventually, he regained some memories, and upon the death of Bodecker and Jones, the movie implies, in a somewhat optimistic ending, that RoboCop becomes Alex again. But still living in a city largely ran by the OCP, with new crime lords likely to surface and corruption in the OCP, with old Detroit still being a total slum, RoboCop's efforts did nothing to actually stop the systematic issues clearly present from the jump, with the news broadcast showing how absolutely fucked the world is, and specifically old Detroit, with the news covering horrendous events while showing satirical commercials of things like heart transplant services that you can buy on credit.
Series 7 Sports Heart by Jensen. Yamaha. You pick the heart. Extended warranties. Financing.
Basically, old Detroit society is so traumatized with constant horrendous events and rampant capitalism that nothing's shocking to them anymore. RoboCop is just another one of these news stories for a hardened society that just kind of hopes they don't die while they load up their credit cards, paying installments on their newest things. There is definitely a question of whether or not RoboCop is an improvement over the standard cops of the city, or the Ed 209 units that the OCP tried replacing the police officers with. Standard cops in this world are essentially an armed militia, with officers' deaths being normal, as seen on Murphy's first day when they're cleaning out a neighboring officer's locker, with his death seemingly being a common event that no one is fazed by.
Funeral's tomorrow. Any donations for the family may be given to Cecil as usual.
Everyone is shoot first, ask questions later, and we know Bodecker has killed multiple cops before the events in the movie. The police are less police officers and more soldiers in a war on crime, with the citizens of old Detroit just forced to live there. On the other hand, you have the Ed 209s, which are supposed to be efficient and powerful, patrolling the streets and standing in for Big Brother, which controls them and defines the laws to these clearly faulty machines, as we saw in the boardroom scene. RoboCop as a middle ground isn't fully efficient either, as the more controllable robot from the start of the film could potentially have the same issues as the Ed 209. What is and isn't crime is programmed with very little nuance. On the other hand, what is RoboCop when his autonomy is seemingly reverted? At the end of the day, he's just another soldier in the war on crime like any other cop, just in a fancy costume. RoboCop is not a solution to the wider problems of the city of Old Detroit, and I think the film knows that at the end, but intentionally glosses over it for this kind of optimistic walking away into the sunshine ending. There's one point in the film where RoboCop is going to kill Boddicker in vengeance, but his programming makes him arrest him instead. His threat is neutralized at this point. Boddicker is quickly released from jail and is back on the streets to take one last attempt at RoboCop soon after. Ultimately, Boddicker's death comes about because he couldn't help but try to kill Anne when she was down. I think these moments say a lot about RoboCop's autonomy as well, and start to show the facade around the robotic shell start to crack a little bit. Despite wanting to kill Boddicker, he physically can't. RoboCop seems to slightly break the robo feel. As we can tell, he resents being forced to bring in Boddicker alive. We see Boddicker plea and beg for RoboCop to arrest him rather than kill him, in a first-person view, putting us in the visor and having the audience share the anger that RoboCop can't kill this villain. Boddicker changes his tune during the booking when he's safely detained, talking shit, and says he'll be out soon.
Shit. Just give me my fucking phone call.
Vanity and the offer of riches are the only reason Boddicker finds himself facing RoboCop again, after he was offered essentially a free pass to restart his crime syndicate in the theoretically bustling Delta City. Most of the villains are fairly cartoony on their surface. Clarence Boddicker is the comically evil supervillain. Jones is the older executive, making power moves. Bob Morton is the young guy making power moves despite the old guard, and is smited for his ambition. Old Man has goals as the CEO of OCP, and ignores the way these goals are achieved by his lower executives. The movie doesn't overtly villainize people like Bob, who was complacent to heinous human trials to move up in OCP, and even victimizes Old Man at one point when Jones, a more overt villain, holds him hostage.
Dick, you're fired!
Thank you.
Everyone in this film plays an exaggerated role, but each makes sense in the context of this world. I don't think RoboCop is so much the story of Alex Murphy or RoboCop, as much as it is the story of old Detroit and a commentary on the path America was headed in terms of super capitalism, degrading health of city, and rising crime rates, which is ironically a lot of issues we're seeing today.
When the ruling white military government of that besieged city-state unveiled a French-made neutron bomb and affirmed its willingness to use the 3-megaton device.
More than 100 people were killed in what is being described as a chaotic incident as IDF soldiers opened fire as people were trying to get food from aid trucks.
Rob Bottin led the special effects team on this film, and he's pretty well respected as an effects man. He also worked with John Carpenter on The Thing, David Fincher a number of times. Verhoeven asked Bottin and his team to make effects as gruesome as possible because he found it funny and especially thought it would evoke feelings of sympathy during Murphy's death, which he found important since we didn't have a lot of time to connect with pre-RoboCop Murphy in the film. Designing the RoboCop suit was another task, as no design was really in mind during writing. Verhoeven insisted on a more robotic design, so Bottin went to work trying to design something that would be somewhat maneuverable for the actor wearing the suit, which was a problem with droids like C-3PO in Star Wars, another relatively recent film.
Whoa!
He took influences from the like of Metropolis and the art of Hajime Sorayama. Verhoeven eventually conceded that it'd be very hard to make an action film with such a sleek suit, like Sorayama would do. So finally, after developing around 50 designs for the character, the team finally settled on the RoboCop we got. RoboCop's tone is interesting. In the film, we find ourselves in a very dark world with constant police killings, crime-ridden, trash-covered streets, and clean and fancy and high-tech boardrooms running it all. Verhoeven and the set design department create an interesting contrast. Look at Bob's house, for example. He's in a clean, high-tech, modern home where he does cocaine, a white-collar drug, with two women who both hope to climb the social ladder by being with him. The boardroom here is sleek and nice, overlooking old Detroit, but perhaps far enough away to not notice how degraded it is. But in contrast, look at the police station, which seems like a dirtied, storied army barracks, or the streets, which are covered in rubble and trash. On top of that, RoboCop is totally humorless as a character, but a lot of executives are so exaggerated it's humorous, with desensitizing violence that is occasionally humorously contextualized, like when Ed 209 shoots the executive up at the start of the film. The music in RoboCop was composed by Basil Polardius. He isn't the most recognizable composer in the world, but he worked on this film, of course, along with Starship Troopers with Verhoeven, Conan the Barbarian, Iron Eagle, and even Free Willy. The score for RoboCop is fitting and iconic. It's intense and robotic, which is obviously a great fit for the character. My favorite use of the score is when RoboCop enters his old home he had as Murphy, and starts having flashbacks of his life, with Murphy seeing his wife and just reflecting on his old life.
Alex. Hey, have you thought it all over? Why not make me an offer?
The score changes to be quieter and more melancholy. It's a pretty great and surprisingly versatile score. Frank Irosetti edited the film and worked in the industry as an editor for decades, with his father working in Hollywood back in the day as a music editor, likely leading Frank into film. He edited similar films like Die Hard and Roadhouse, but went on to edit Basic Instinct and Total Recall for Verhoeven, since Verhoeven likes working with certain collaborators often. Frank did a good job editing together the fun, gory, and exciting concepts in RoboCop. The film is also very tight. There aren't really any moments that don't add to the base narrative, the satire, or the world building. This movie is incredibly tightly woven, and Frank did a good job putting it all together. Joss Vankano did the cinematography on this film, and he's another frequent Verhoeven regular, doing 7 films with the director in total, starting with Soldier of Orange, before doing RoboCop, Total Recall, Showgirls, Starship Troopers, and Hollow Man. The film looks great, kind of has a newsreel feel to it, with drab colors, which I think is perfect for the world of old Detroit. The shot composition is great, and add in the great action scenes, and it's overall just really good cinematography for the film that Verhoeven was trying to create. If possible, watch this on the Arrow 4K. They did a kick-ass transfer of the film. Arrow does great stuff, and it's one of the only ways to watch the full uncensored director's cut, which just adds back some of the violence that was cut to keep the film R-rated, not X-rated. The director's cut was originally added back in the Criterion release, which I have as well, but that version's weirdly cropped, so the Arrow upgrade is definitely the definitive way to watch it. I also watched this film on digital, which is probably the standard Blu-ray rip, and I think it looks a little over-vibrant and color-corrected, which wasn't too uncommon for early Blu-ray films, but you got options though. Overall, I love RoboCop. It's an amazing film that is a beautifully elevated action film, and while it sits on the same vein as Predator, Die Hard, Mad Max, and First Blood, it tries hard to take a different angle. I'm in no way diminishing those films, as those are all standout examples of the action genre in the 1980s with their own warrants and angles. I'm just saying what Verhoeven and his other close collaborators managed to do here was a cutting example of satire and action, with strong editing, shot composition, and writing forming together in what may be my favorite action film of the decade. Peter Weller was never a star in the same way the actors in the former 4 mentioned examples were, but he's iconic in the role and continues to get great roles, even if they're a bit smaller. He played a part in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek films, Batman in the stellar Dark Knight Returns animated adaptation, did bit parts all over for film and television really, hosted the History Channel show Engineering an Empire, which at least at my high school was regularly played. Like, I've seen all those episodes like 15 times.
This is the Cathedral of Paris, Notre Dame de Paris. It ain't bad, is it?
And recently even took back up his iconic Alex Murphy and RoboCop roles from Mortal Kombat 11 and RoboCop Rogue City in FPS from late last year for PS5 and Xbox Series X. he's doing alright for himself, even if he's not larger than life like Stallone, Willis, or Schwarzenegger. RoboCop was a success with a total budget of $13.7 million and making $53.4 million, making a healthy profit at the box office, and going on to be a fierce contender in the rental market, where it was huge and promoted in a cheeky ad campaign that included having RoboCop shake hands with disgraced President Richard Nixon, who was paid $25,000 for the publicity stunt. It's pretty funny, especially considering you could draw corruption comparisons between Nixon and characters like Dick Jones. Nixon did donate his earnings to charity, which is good at least. I don't want to knock the man entirely, but it's a pretty hilarious thing for this film to do, and it shows the satire didn't end on the screen. It's fair to say the film made tons of money and spawned a multimedia franchise not too dissimilar to many other action hits from the day. The film spawned 2 direct sequels, RoboCop 2 and 3, a remake just named RoboCop, a cartoon named RoboCop, which was a surprisingly common thing for R-rated movies to get in the 80s, a lot like cartoons of rated R movies. It was a weird fad. A live action series in the 90s titled RoboCop, a second animated show called RoboCop Alpha Commando, and a series of 4 live action TV films under the RoboCop Prime Directives banner. Paul Verhoeven wouldn't continue working in the franchise, but we would see Irving Kershner take over for the sequel, and he's the master of sequels in my opinion, bringing back Sean Connery as James Bond after a 13-year hiatus for a non-Eon produced sequel to James Bond and remake of Thunderball, Never Say Never Again, which is an amazing film in my opinion and is an underrated 80s action film, which admittedly it's more of an action film than a Bond film proper. And he also directed what's widely considered the best sequel of all time, The Empire Strikes Back. So while I haven't seen RoboCop 2 yet, I'm interested, and we'll eventually talk about that film. Don't worry, it's on my very long and ever-growing list of content to do. Regardless, Shazam is next as a continuation of my DCEU retrospective series, so stay tuned for that soon.